Thanks, Stephen. And yes, this is, to some extent, you're being used as guinea pigs today because the CEDA board is having a discussion about how it actually continues to promote ideas that it has put out there. We have a model very much of putting out reports. They are written by eminent people. We put a level of quality editing around them, but largely we put them out as the ideas and the views of the authors of those reports. But occasionally, as you know, and certainly in the case that I'm going to talk about today, we said CEDA has a view. And the view is one that we endorse as an organisation, certainly as a board. And then we started to talk about, well, all right, once we've done that, what else do we do? Do we actually just put it out there as a standard report, or do we start to talk about it? Do we actually have some level of advocacy? So to some extent, bringing it up again at State of the Nation is part of the exercise of saying maybe that there is some logic in CEDA continuing to promote and argue for particular points of view. So I'd be interested, over time I'm sure we'll be discussing this with the members, and we're very keen to have your advice. There are dangers in doing this. We could start to look partisan and a player and a lobby group, and of course that's something that we're determined not to do. So that's the context, and so I'm here to talk about the federal budget repair, and it was an area, as I say, singled out in a unique way by CEDA's board and councils as a priority area. And I think there's no better place to talk about that, of course, than in Parliament House. Now, back in late March, as Stephen said, during a press club address to launch this particular document, I made some would say, bold statement that no economic problem which is in our power to resolve is graver and more urgent in Australia than the persistence of large budget deficits. Now, in making that judgment, the report noted that it is a particularly alarming problem given that we have had more than a quarter of a century of sustained economic expansion. So you wouldn't expect us to be having budget deficits through that whole process. Now, 6 months on, at this speech, after the budget and after the election, I would argue with some regret that that statement remains valid. Now, we have seen some movement on some measures and some of the right noises coming from government and Parliament, but progress on budget repair still remains disappointingly slow. Now, today I want to provide you with an update on what progress has been made and why this is an issue that we believe must remain a priority. Now, this reflection is particularly timely given that the Treasurer released the final budget outcome for fiscal year 16 just a couple of weeks ago, confirming a $40 billion deficit, equivalent to 2.3% of GDP, with, in our view, no believable end to the deficit in sight. Now, CEDA's report back in March set out a realistic path, and we stressed the word, we thought it was realistic, to surplus that could be achieved by fiscal year 2019. Under the guidance of a panel of experts in the Balanced Budget Commission that we set up, and there are a number of you here today, we set fiscal year 2019 as the target date to return to balance, which happened also to be the end of the forward estimates at the time we wrote the report. And this was our first key recommendation. We saw no benefit in delay unless there was a significant change, obviously, to the nation's economic performance, which really there hasn't been so far, but it's still early days, I guess. Now, our rationale for urgency was that prolonged deficit penalised today's youth and future generations. It is they who will end up paying for current spending, despite Australians being wealthier than they've ever been. Secondly, running large deficits means we have no buffer when we experienced unexpected economic shocks, and we are wasting money on paying interest on debt that could otherwise be spent on delivering services and infrastructure. And finally, and thirdly, we also argued that real tax reform, the really hard stuff, must be undertaken, and it is extremely difficult to do that if, to begin with, you've got to deal with solving a major deficit. So having determined 2019 as the key date, we then looked at how to get a balance by that year. And in doing so, I think the Commission had a very sensible way of doing it. We adopted a tax cap of 23.9% of GDP, and which is essentially the average share of tax to GDP in the years beginning or between the introduction of GST in fiscal year 2001 and the GFC in 2009. And in fact, there's a long history of bipartisan support for broadly tax levels at that level. Now that gives you a total revenue of 25.5% because there's other revenues of about 1.6. So if 25.5% is our total revenue target, then quite clearly that is also your target for expenditure. So these caps on tax and expenditure was the second key recommendation. 2019 was the first. And then we went on to analyse and we put forward a number of revenue and expenditure measures that governments could choose from. It's quite a smorgasbord of slightly miserable things, from which to achieve balance by fiscal year 19 using those caps on tax and expenditure. And we suggested 5 different packages. I won't go through them obviously all here today. They are in the document that Stephen has waved before you and that I was about to. But I will say that the options were each designed to provide a practical and fair combination of measures. The first 2 packages leaned heavily on superannuation, while capital gains tax features to some extent in all of them, as do the limited indirect taxes still available to us, such as alcohol and tobacco excises and luxury car tax. Now, while the measures selected were what we believe to be realistic and politically palatable, the individual measures themselves are not what we really wanted the primary focus of the report to be. Instead, we sought to articulate how urgent and significant the persistence of budget deficits is, how important it is to get the balance back to balance as soon as possible, and thirdly, our belief that this is achievable. Now, it must be said that in proposing what we believed were workable options, our hands were somewhat tied by decisions of the major parties not to explore some of the broader, genuine tax reform options, including perhaps the raising and broadening of the GST. So we had to work around those to find proposals, but we did. So it has been an interesting year indeed for Australian politics, and although CEDA's report was only released in March, a number of significant events have happened since, not least of which, of course, there was a federal election. In the weeks following the launch of the report, credit agency Moody's made headline news when it warned us that Australia's AAA rating could be at risk due to persisting government debt. And they expressed pessimism at the federal government's aim to balance the budget by 2021 with expenditure measures only, echoing some of my own words at the launch of the CEDA report at the Press Club. Now, they were joined with a chorus of voices, mainly from the economic commentariat, expressing similar concerns unless something serious was done about budget repair. However, the government and the opposition remained eerily quiet. In fact, probably one of the quietest responses we've ever had from any CEDA report. Now, unfortunately, the public debate shifted away from budget repair as soon as the election campaign was in full swing, and even the May budget failed to kickstart that conversation. Now, this changed in August, when addressing a CEDA audience in his first major economic address after the election, the Prime Minister put the need for budget repair firmly back on the agenda. And echoing my words, I'm not sure meaningly or he meant to, but nevertheless, echoing my words at the Press Club back in March, the Prime Minister made it quite clear that without budget repair, the youth of today will be paying back mountains of debt, he said, that we've accumulated for them. And this was followed, you will recall, by a speech by the Treasurer, expressing very much the same urgency for budget repair, stating that we must restore the budget to balance if we are to arrest the growth in our public debt. Now, we welcome very much the Prime Minister's and the Treasurer's efforts to put this very important task for repairing the budget back on the agenda. I hope it's not too pointed for CEDA to remark, however, that the force of those speeches would have been greater if they had been made before the election, and perhaps even taking up the challenge that we put out to all the parties in March. Probably also have more force if they were not seen to be linked to particular legislation before the Parliament at that time. And certainly the jury is out as to whether the tone of those speeches is going to be consistently maintained. And of course, that's what you've got to do if you're going to move the dial on this matter. Nevertheless, while they may not have used the strong language used by Joe Hockey when he was the Treasurer, we are now getting clear messages from the government that there will be significant consequences if we don't bring the budget back to balance. And tellingly, the Treasurer also admitted that we have an earnings problem, in stark contrast to the previous assertions to the contrary, which was that we just had an expenditure problem, marking perhaps a shift in the government's stance. And so I think the signs of greater flexibility on the measures available to solve the problem are a move in the right direction. So, our report acknowledged that this task is not an easy one. The measures, even in our reports, were not easy to do. But it is certainly even more difficult to argue for expenditure cuts or to raise taxes when the economy seems to be going well and we've not had a recession since the early 1990s. But of course, that's the very point of why you have to do this. And there is no doubt in our mind that it must and can be done. If we don't repair the budget soon, we will have a ballooning public debt problem on our hands, and it will be far, far harder to fix further down the line. And in particular, the long-term outlook for the budget is quite different from what we've all got used to. The easy surpluses, as long as you're patient, are gone, and demographic change is about to work against us. So we need the government to make tough choices, and our belief is that it will be crucial to look at both expenditure and revenue measures if we're realistically to bring the budget back to balance in the short to medium term and keep it in balance. Now, yes, the ship has probably sailed when it comes to a return to surplus by the end of fiscal 19. You had to have moved probably at the last budget, or certainly indicated some very serious measures during the election campaign. However, with the right set of measures and political leadership and some bipartisan support, and there were signs of that, I think, in the last 24 hours here in our own report, a return to surplus by the end of the decade is still within the realm of possibility. So following the speeches by the Prime Minister and the Treasurer to create a sense of urgency around budget repair, the Omnibus Savings Bill was announced. And the bill, which has since passed, consisted of saving measures amounting to an increased revenue of about $6 billion over 4 years. Measures included a new minimum repayment threshold income for HECS and HELP, debt, extending the pause in the indexation of income for private health insurance rebate, lowering the income limit for eligibility of some of the family tax benefits. Now, while this is a good start, it is not nearly enough to repair the budget. I mean, our report was looking for an improvement of $17 billion in fiscal year 2019 alone, not over 4 years. So, as an example, CEDA recommended the cutting of private health insurance rebate by 25% was one of the options, which would save the government an estimated $1.8 billion per year rather than the $200 million it is saving by extending indexation. So you can see the level of size hugely different. It's a scale issue, perhaps. Now, one issue of our report, which maybe does need defence, was that it stated that the only realistic way to balance the budget quickly was to increase revenue, and $15 billion of the $17 billion target would have had to come from revenue. And we understand not everybody was happy with that focus. But of course, the distinction between revenue and savings can be very misleading. And some of the savings measures that are aimed solely at increasing revenue. If you change the superannuation system, you're basically aiming to increase income tax from those particular taxpayers. So broadly, some of the distinction doesn't make a lot of sense when you're trying to think it through. But the idea that you can quickly turn around by what I would call real savings which are not related to revenue, such as defence or health or all the other things that the Commonwealth Government spends its money on, the Commission believed that to do that over the short term was not possible. And everything that has happened since tells me that that judgment was correct. And of course there was also the problem that while many of the things that were put in that bill were actually supported by different CEDA reports over recent years, and they're all pretty good measures, one of the problems is that a lot of the revenue that was raised during those measures is being spent elsewhere in the budget. So that doesn't bode well, I think, for budget repair. And I'd have to say, as a personal note, and I might get into trouble with this, some measures, such as taxing multinationals, have a long history of being trotted out whenever a government is trying to fill a deficit gap. I remember that from my time here. So perhaps this time, of course, those global giants will see the light and want to pay us a lot more tax, but trusting your surplus on that event may be seen over time as optimistic. So the final budget outcome shows that the revenue problem is alive and well, but also the solution is also alive and well. In fiscal year 2016, revenue as a share of GDP was 23.5, well below CEDA's cap of 25.5, and the government's cap as well, I might say, and unchanged from fiscal year 2015. So this is not a real sign of aggressive solution to this problem. So despite the measures announced since CEDA released its report, and despite the change in rhetoric around budget repair, I remain unconvinced that we are really any closer to achieving surplus within a reasonable time frame. So where from here? Well, there have been a lot of useful reports and inquiries that have variously recommended the next wave of genuine economic reform needed to sustain Australia as it transitions to the brave new world. We've talked about a lot of that yesterday. And these have canvassed tax reform, superannuation, tackling welfare dependency. Our own second report, the report that balances this one, Australia's Economic Future, an Agenda for Growth, was our attempt to identify the key challenges that we thought were part of that greater challenge. But what we definitely call for is a comprehensive public policy approach that determines the outcomes for the greater good. A narrative that clearly explains to the Australian people why these policies are necessary, and I welcome Bill Shorten's contribution to that this morning over breakfast, and an explanation that hard decisions have to be taken, but that the future of the nation will be improved if those decisions are made. And I would say that I think this balanced budget report, as a call to arms when it comes to budget repair, is still a very good starting point for that discussion. So I think, my bottom line on all of this is that CEDA will continue to try and promote this sort of discussion, and I'd very much welcome any contribution that you all have to that exercise. Thank you.